Welcome to However Many Minutes. I'm your host, Taylor Robinson. Today we are going to be viewing unseen footage from the late 1700s and the early 1800s of Thomas Jefferson towards the end of his presidential term. He will be telling us about what he believes to be his greatest achievements and his greatest failures throughout his time in office. The Louisiana Purchase, which took place in 1803, was arguably the best thing that Jefferson accomplished. The French possessed a large area of land west of the states. This land stretched from what we now know as the Gulf of Mexico all the way to Canada. In other words, it was all the land between the Rocky Mountains and the Mississippi River, about 827,000 square miles of land. Jefferson bargained with France and gained all of this land for a mere $15 million, or today, $250 million.
So, Mr. President, how did the Louisiana Purchase come about?
The Louisiana Purchase came to help the land needs of the expanding country. Also, it was needed to find the northwest route in order to trade with Asia, as the original purpose of the colonies was to expand wealth. The states now also want to expand our wealth and be able to pay off the debts of the war faster. We also needed to push the rivals of France away and legally claim our land that the Native Americans gave us through the Treaty of Greenville.
What benefits do you feel came from the Louisiana Purchase?
There were many benefits that came from the Louisiana Purchase, as it drove the French away, as we still technically were indebted to them, and were still enemies. We got to the ports of New Orleans to establish more of a global trade on the other side, where the British wasn't monitoring the trade between us and the other countries. I also doubled the size of America as well. I kept the cultivation of new land in the country alive and gave political stability to the government, as the legislative branch would need to pass more ordinances or lands to the land anytime soon.
Why do you think that it angered Federalists?
I believe that the Louisiana Purchase angered the Federalists, as they believed in the equal yet proportional representation, and that there were already high interests in the land of the West. I have reason to believe that they were worried that I had only purchased the land out of reflex, and that we had the sufficient amount of funds to do so. I also believe that they were thinking that I would try to make the West more powerful, as there was more land and that there were more people migrating to those areas.
Another one of Jefferson's greatest achievements was the Lewis and Clark expedition. In the spring of 1804, Lewis and Clark and 50 others set out of Virginia. On their journey, they spent the winter in North Dakota. Between that winter and April 1805, they met the famous Sacagawea. She and other natives guided the Lewis and Clark expedition through the unknown territory gained in the Louisiana Purchase. They encountered many other Native American tribes on their journey. Their journey concluded in 1806.
What was the purpose of the expedition?
The purpose of the expedition in 1804 was to provide information to create maps and journals of the unknown land that the French were just willing to give us. There was also the purpose to try to find more about Native Americans. I also wanted to see if there was a connecting river or waterway between the Missouri and Columbia rivers, as these connected to the Pacific Ocean and allowed easier trade in the Gulf of Mexico.
What benefits came from it?
The Lewis and Clark expedition was certainly not a failure of my presidency, as we got much information about the Osage, Sioux, Cheyenne, Blackfeet, Shoshone, and the Nez Perce Indians, just to name a few. We also found Indians that were already connected to the global market. There was also a lot of geographical data about the terrain, plants, animals, and specimens of the West. We did successfully find a waterway that allowed us to get to the Gulf of Mexico. I'm most pleased also with the fact that Lewis and Clark made an ally with Sacagawea. This was important, as she was a good guide in terms of showing off the important landmarks and an interpreter that we can use with the nearby Indians.
During the time of Jefferson's presidency, the Supreme Court was Federalist, while he and Congress were Republican. Because of this, great conflict arose. Jefferson replaced most of the marshals with Republican officials. Also, 2 judges were tried for impeachment during Jefferson's time in office. Justice John Pickering, who was an alcoholic and undoubtedly insane, and Justice Samuel Chase, who was an anti-Jeffersonian and often delivered streams of abuse from the bench. Samuel Chase was lucky and was not removed from the court, while John Pickering was. Judicial review also became a power of the Supreme Court after the case of Marbury and Madison when Jefferson held office. This case gave Supreme Court the power to interpret the Constitution and declare laws unconstitutional. This act reduced the number of Supreme Court justices from 6 to 5, preventing Jefferson from making more Republican appointments.
The Supreme Court right now is Federalist, but you're a Republican. How are you going to approach and work with the Supreme Court during your time in office?
I'm going to work with the Supreme Court as I had reevaluated putting an alcoholic as a Supreme Justice. I also gave the Supreme Court the power to interpret the Constitution and declare laws unconstitutional. I also had to put an act to reduce the Supreme Court justices to 5 instead of 6. This limited my ideals of a more Republican government, but had a lot of support to balance the government to the perspectives of its people.
How do you feel about the Supreme Court possessing more power with judicial review?
I feel that it is a better fit to America as the Supreme Court cannot try someone with their interpretation of the texts. Only the literal words in the Constitution were permitted. It doesn't represent my Republican ideals necessarily, but it allows for a more balanced government and yet still fits the rules of checks and balances in the federal type of government.
Conflict arose in Jefferson's presidency when he urged Congress to pass the Embargo Act of 1807. This act prohibited trade with foreign nations. He urged peaceful coercion and reasoned that British and French relied heavily on American goods, and he hoped it would push them to work with the United States. The act did more harm than good. American farmers and manufacturers had no place to sell their goods, which angered them greatly. As a result, the support for the Republican Party plummeted, and the Federalists rose to power.
What was the purpose behind peaceful coercion?
My intentions were to anger the British and the French in order to push them to agree to work with us as allies rather than enemies. We had been experiencing unfair treatment from the British and French for several years, and this form of retaliation seemed to be a good option as they were both fairly dependent on American goods. I was led to believe that this idea, that if the Embargo Act worked, it would give the rights of neutral nations and paint a new way of conducting foreign affairs with each other.
Was the Embargo Act beneficial?
Unfortunately, stopping exports not only angered the American people, but also led situations between us to worsen. Many argue that this negatively impacted the economy, left America unprotected, and it led to federalism becoming more popular. However, I soon replaced it with the Non-Intercourse Act, which helped us get revenge on the French and British.
What were the effects of the Embargo Act, and how did that lead to the repealing of it?
I do feel limiting all trade, not with just France and Britain, was a mistake of my presidency. The Federalist Party began to make a resurgence as voters eyed the upcoming election. Critics shouted that my decisions damaged the economy. Many of the farmers and merchants were also saying the same things, as I didn't give them any external outlets of trade. This led to the fact that I finally had to concede defeat and repeal the embargo during my last days in office. Then Congress passed the Non-Intercourse Act, which reopened trade with all countries except France and Britain.
How do you feel about the captured people on American ships being recruited to the British Navy?
Well, after I heard about the summer of 1807, when the crew of the British frigate Leopard stopped the American ship Chesapeake and proceeded to killing 3 Americans and injuring several more, I ordered all British ships to leave the U.S. territorial waters. But I knew that the British would respond with even more aggressive searches, so that led me to also repeal the embargo.
Thomas Jefferson had some ups and downs while he was president. His greatest accomplishment and the positives from his presidency include the Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark expedition. However, his presidency consisted of judicial problems and the idea of peaceful coercion. Thank you for joining us. I'm your host, Taylor Robinson. See you next time on However Many Minutes.